The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name is Guy and I'm from IT Masters, and welcome to week 1 of another short course, the VMware vSphere 6 Masterclass short course, facilitated by IT Masters in partnership with Information Technology Professionals Association, or ITPA. This is the first of hopefully many courses we will collaborate on, and we are most excited to see what comes with the partnership in the future. Before handing over to your mentor for the next 4 weeks, Robert Hudson, just a bit of housekeeping is in order though. All webinars for this course will be held at 8 o'clock, 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, which is plus 11 UTC, and this first one will focus on vSphere 6 and vCenter. In addition to Robert, Chantel is on hand in a technical support role. She's here just in case there are any major technical issues with the class tonight, which we're not anticipating. She's one of the people responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, which is where you'll find all materials needed for this course, readings, discussion, forums, and those sorts of things, homework, and 24 hours after each lecture, which is recorded, they will be available on that website too. If you have any questions tonight or later on, please feel free to contact us via the forum there. I'll be fielding any questions you may have during the webinar, which you can send in using the chat function of GoToWebinar. If they are simple matters, I will try to answer them, or if they're related to course content, I'll flag them for Robert's attention for question and answer sessions throughout the webinar. Our email, should you require any assistance, is shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au. But that's enough out of me, I think. Please welcome Robert Hudson.
Hello all. Thank you for attending this VMware vSphere 6 Masterclass, as Guy has mentioned, brought to you by both IT Masters and Information Technology Professionals Association, or ITPA. So, let's get into it. We've got an hour. I've got roughly 25 slides, so I'm not going to spend too much time on each slide. But certainly, if there are questions, I will try to get to them and make sure that we don't leave people in the lurch wondering what's going on. So just a little bit of information on myself. So I've worked in IT for around 20 years, and I'm currently responsible for managing the IT infrastructure across Asia Pacific for a global multinational. The company is headquartered in Europe. I am based in Sydney in Australia. I have technology certifications from vendors such as Cisco, Microsoft, VMware, and EMC. Obviously, I have a history in VMware. I'm also a former student of the Charles Sturt University /IT Masters course, having done the Masters of Networking and System Administration degree. I have been the Sage AU President since 2012 and a member for over 15 years now, and I'm the founding President of ITPA. Okay, so very quickly the agenda for the 4 or 5 weeks. So this week we're looking at what's new in vSphere 6. I'm also going to touch on what's been announced in vSphere 6.5, which was only announced less than 24 hours ago, or just over 24 hours ago, sorry, and also some work on vCenter. What is it? How does it work? What are the components? In week 2, we're going to focus on virtual networking. I have posted, or there has been posted, some information in the learning portal on some background information on networking. If anybody is not particularly focused on networking in their careers or learning, then there's some background information there that may help. Certainly some of the concepts we'll be covering are based on an understanding of some of that base networking knowledge. In week 3 we'll be looking at virtual storage, and again there is a storage primer on the learning portal. Again, it would be very handy for anybody who is not strong on storage, and in particular shared storage, server-based storage, that they go and read through that. It will give you some ideas of some of the concepts that we'll be covering and expanding upon. In week 4 we'll look at high availability, what it means, and not just HA, or high availability, which is one of the features of the vSphere, but also some of the other features, DRS, storage DRS. There's a couple of features we'll go into. Again, I'm not going to talk about them too much right now because we'll talk about them more in week 4. And week 5 is your assessment. Now, on top of the assessments, there will be homework each week. This week, your homework will be to go set yourself up a lab, if that's at all possible in your situation. Again, there's been some information posted into the forum. There's also some information in this week's slide deck on where you can go grab the things you need in order to set up that lab. There will be a formal assessment at the end of the course, and there is actually a pass-fail. So those who pass will be awarded a certificate of achievement. So really this week, getting on to this week's topics, we are looking at what's new in vSphere and vCenter. Okay, there's a couple of people complaining they don't have audio. I'll just get that confirmed. Guy, are you able to hear my audio?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
Fine.
Yeah, audio is working with me.
Okay, audio is fine. The only video there is will be the slides, guys. I'm not going to scare you. You're going to get scared. In fact, you got scared last slide with the photo. I'm not going to make you watch me talk as well. Certainly, the slides are all there is. We are providing the slides. I think there's a copy of them up already on the forums, but there will also be a recording of the webinar each week.
Yeah, we do recommend if you are having a bit of trouble with audio, just logging off and logging back on again. Other than that, there's not really much we can do this end.
The recording that I do is done at my end, so given that almost my technology is local to me, you should get a decent quality recording out of it. Okay, going back to the topic, the recording includes chat. There'll be some stuff that comes up. I'm not sure exactly what. I'm actually going to get rid of that in case it's coming up on screen in the recording because it's going to make things difficult. Okay, so we're going to look at what's new in vSphere 6, some licensing issues. There have been some changes in licensing of late. I will touch on the changes between 5.5 or 5.1, 5.5 and 6. There were some changes in licensing there as well. We're going to look at the components of vCenter, what they are, what they do, why you need them. Look at some vCenter deployment options. And it's not mentioned in here because I literally only added it to the slide deck about half an hour ago, but there's some information there as well about vSphere 6.5, as I mentioned, announced just on 24 hours ago, and then some options for your home lab setups. Okay, moving along. So the first section that we're going to look at is what's new in vSphere 6. Okay, so with each release of vSphere, VMware obviously work to improve the product. They're competing with some other products out there in the market. Hyper-V is probably the biggest one, though there's some others like Zen and a couple of open source based products. But really the key scalability improvements, and certainly scalability is something they generally focus on quite strongly with upgrades. So in each virtual host, the CPU cores per host under vSphere 5.5 was 320, under vSphere 6 it's 480, so that's a substantial, it's 50% improvement. That's fairly large. A lot of people probably work in environments where that's simply not relevant. However, you have to remember that this underpins things like vCloud and some of the much larger environments. So these scalability improvements are significant. The amount of RAM per host, and this is probably more important, so under 5.5 it was 4 terabytes. And again, you might think 4 terabytes, well that's a lot of RAM. Well, when you start looking at some fairly major sized databases, and especially if you're looking at databases running in memory, it's actually not that much. And the concern there is that while your RAM per host is set at 4 terabytes, that's also the maximum RAM any one VM can consume as well. Because one of the things that VMware don't do yet, and it may come in the future, I don't know, but you cannot split the resources required to run a single VM across multiple hosts. So the amount of RAM per host was increased from 4 terabyte to 12 terabyte. Virtual machines per host has moved from 512 to 1,000, so you probably notice we've gone from a base to a binary base number to an even decimal base number. It's not particularly relevant. It's just the increase is an almost 100% increase. The number of hosts per cluster, again 100% increase from 32 to 64. Again, if you're running in environments, especially if you're running things like VMware Standard, vCenter Standard, or vSphere Standard, sorry, or some of the Foundation or Essentials packages that are around there, some of them are actually limited to 3 hosts in an environment. So again, if you're not running big environments, it's not probably that interesting. But yeah, the scalability is there, and you can look at the coding that would have had to be done to extend the product from the 5.5 numbers to the version 6 numbers, and we'll get to some of the changes to 6.5 in a minute, and they're talking about 2 and 3 times in some areas. Virtual machines per cluster has jumped from 4,000 to 8,000. Virtual CPUs per virtual machine has jumped from 64 to 128. Again, if you're running massively parallel workloads, that's important, or may be important to you. If you're not running massively parallel workloads, it's probably not that critical. The amount of VRAM, or virtual RAM, per virtual machine has increased from 1 terabyte to 4 terabytes. You noticed before I said, well, you're limited in a single VM to how much RAM is in the host anyway, but what this means is you can now run 3 very large VMs on a host, of up to 4 terabytes of RAM capacity each. Generally, in most workloads, if they're using that much RAM, they can probably be split across multiple hosts or multiple virtual machines anyway, the workload itself. The number of serial ports per virtual machine has increased substantially from 4 to 32. Again, a lot of people don't use serial ports these days, but a lot of people do. I work in an environment where serial port usage is fairly heavy because we interface with devices that are communicated with over serial or RS-232 and things like that. So that can be of interest for some people. Just questioning. Veneer has asked the differences between ESX and ESXi. There is no ESX anymore. It's gone. Hasn't been around for a little while. Difference between RAM per VM and VRAM. So the difference between RAM per host, the host is the physical server, a virtual machine is a virtual machine running on that. Trainer went silent. I don't believe I have. Certainly if Guy or Chantal, if that does happen, pop up with me for a while. Tony, I've moved the mic a little bit. We are talking about ESXi, absolutely, because there is no ESX anymore. So vSphere 6 includes ESXi 6. There is no ESX. ESX was dropped. One of the reasons and one of the big improvements that came out of dropping ESX is the footprint of the installation. If you do an ESXi install, I think 140 meg is about the footprint of it at the moment. You can install that on a small flash device. .5 is technically available for download. Let me talk about that later. So there, your scalability improvements, certainly big scalability changes. So I'll try to, and I mentioned to Guy, I will try to watch questions as we go. CPU cores per host. So CPUs come in sockets, and there are multiple sockets. So each socket can then have multiple CPU cores in it. So you have a quad-core CPU. You're talking about a single socket with 4 execution cores. Serial port connections are virtualized. That is correct. So there is a virtual serial port, and there's also a virtual USB driver, USB being a different kind of serial communication, that is virtualized.
Getting a flood of questions. It's really great.
Look, this is, I love it. Yeah, I'll try and
prioritize as much as possible, and yeah, we'll try and get to.
Yeah, so the limit is cores, not sockets. Technically, yes. Of course, it depends then how many cores you have per socket. It used to be a big thing to have a dual-core CPU or a quad-core CPU. You're now looking at 12 and 16 core Intel Xeon CPUs. So, yeah. Yes, in the end, the limit is cores per host. Dan has asked about the difference between vSphere, vCenter, ESXi. That's a very good point, Dan. So, ESXi is the hypervisor software itself. It runs on a single host and provides virtualization services to workloads, which are your virtual machines. vCenter is the management platform. So it's a platform, it's a piece of software or multiple pieces of software bundled together in a suite of functions that allow you to manage multiple ESXi hosts from a single point of management. It also coordinates some of the functionality and increases the functionality that ESXi offers. So ESXi, you can't do a vMotion on ESXi itself because ESXi can't, as a standalone product, can't move a VM to another product. vCenter, one of the things that vCenter allows is the ability to move a workload or a virtual machine from one host to another. vSphere is the name for the suite of virtualization products that VMware offer. You're looking at vCenter, ESXi, Update Manager, Platform Services Controller, Site Recovery Manager, There's a whole bunch of APIs. So there's the vSphere APIs for data protection, the vSphere APIs for array integration for storage. There's a whole bunch of software. Will the course cover API calls? No, we're not going that deep. That would be a deep dive. This is a masterclass where we're looking at fairly high level, but talking, certainly I do this every day of my life. Is PowerShell supported? Yes, there is support for PowerShell or versions of PowerShell, yes. About an hour the class will run each night, 4 weeks. So somebody asked why the VMs be limited. Yeah, there are limits per VM and then per host. The limits per VM don't add up to the number of the limits per host. So in the end, you're limited to how many VMs you can really run if you're running them all at the biggest size. Technically, there's no hard join between a physical CPU core and a virtual CPU core, other than at the time the virtual CPU core is executing commands, at which point each virtual CPU core is scheduled against a physical CPU core. All the questions captured, that I have to check. We will mention fault tolerance during the high availability section. Licensing is per physical host. It's not, and there are limits in terms of CPU. So you can get either a CPU license or a host license. There's no limits on the VMs for those licenses. Only what you can manage to run up. The web client includes most things. Under version 6 update 2, it now also includes Update Manager. It is the future. I will get to that shortly.
Robert, we're getting absolutely smashed by questions.
Yep.
I might ask Chantal to help me sort them out, please, and get a few.
Cool. So what I might do, guys, is, I focus on the questions later, because otherwise, we are going to sort of run out. I don't want to spend too long on them because otherwise we're going to run late. We're already almost 20 minutes in, and we're only
just a quick
in.
word on the level of the course, though, Robert. There's some pre-assumed knowledge, but as you said, it's not going to be a deep dive. Just can you give people a brief overview of maybe like how deep we're going, and then people can gauge their questions to that.
Yeah, we're going to focus at a relatively high level on the core technologies that form the vSphere suite. We will talk about implementation details. We will talk about where there have been differences to previous versions, where there are benefits to certain decisions that VMware have made over other vendors, and certainly some memory over subscription benefits to the VMware solution over Hyper-V, as an example. We won't be diving into coding or into scripting or into really deeply into any one particular topic. We simply won't have time.
And as Stuart has said just on the chat now, if people do have questions about it, we can always use the forums later. So if you want to talk about a particular issue, feel free to start a thread, and then we can all respond.
Okay, what I'll do, I'll start focusing on just the questions you guys red flag, because otherwise I think we're going to get swamped. Okay, so moving on from scalability improvements, so vMotion enhancements. So one of the other things that happened with vSphere 6 is there was some enhancement to vMotion and the way that operates. So under vSphere 5.5, you could not execute a vMotion from one vSwitch to another. That is now possible under vSphere 6. You can also these days move from one type of vSwitch, a standard vSwitch, to a distributed vSwitch and vice versa. So that is now possible as well. Now I've mentioned here cross vCenter vMotion wasn't even supported under 5.5. It is supported under vSphere 6 with some caveats. So you have to be, your vCenter servers need to be under a single SSO domain, and the the ping or the latency round trip time between sources and destinations has grown from 10 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds. Now that doesn't sound like an awful lot, but that is from the east coast of the US to the west coast of the US, or Australia almost, if you're lucky, from Sydney to Singapore. Now that's a substantial increase in how far you can move your VMs geographically. 10 milliseconds is barely getting across a LAN segment, and certainly maybe from one side of town to the other. So you might have been able to, if you had 2 data centers in one city, you might be able to vMotion a virtual machine between data centers in a city. These days you can do them across the country. I'm not sure how big an increase this has been with 6.5. I'll have to find out. Hasn't been specified as yet in what I've seen. You can also do vMotion across layer 3 boundaries these days. What that means is routed. Under 5.5, you could not route your vMotion traffic. It had to exist within a single subnet, or technically, if you're looking at layer 3 boundaries, a single broadcast domain, or a VLAN. Under vSphere 6, you can actually move your virtual machines from one network, or one layer 3 network segment, to another. The other thing they improved in vSphere 6 is they gave us a dedicated TCP/IP stack for vMotion. Before, when you configured your vMotion or your VM kernel ports, they all shared a default gateway, and that included things like if you're using software iSCSI or iSCSI in general, they shared some configuration items, and that made things a little bit tricky at times. If you had an iSCSI network that you didn't want to route, but you had a management network that you did want to route, you were torn between the two. These days, there's actually a dedicated TCP/IP stack, and you can make decisions on the vMotion stack itself as to how it's configured from a layer 3 perspective. As I mentioned, if you need to know more about networking and what layer 3 means, please go to the network information that's been provided in the forums. Improvements to fault tolerance, and somebody asked this before. Excuse me, I'm about to cough, and I don't wish to do that down the line. Sorry about that. Okay, so fault tolerance under 5.5 was a nice idea, but in practice it just didn't work, or didn't work well. The use cases for it were extremely limited, and the reasons for this were: the maximum number of virtual CPUs you could have in a virtual machine that was protected by fault tolerance was 1. Now that's not a lot, and certainly there are benefits to keeping the number of virtual CPUs in a virtual machine as low as you can within reason. You should always start with 1 virtual CPU and only increase if you actually can prove there is a performance benefit in doing so. But on the kind of workloads that you might have thought you wanted to put fault tolerance over, having only 1 virtual CPU was quite a strict limitation. You could only use eager lazy zero disks. So when you provision virtual disks, you either provision thin provisioned, you provision either eager lazy zero, it's eager zeroed or lazy zeroed. Sorry, this should actually say eager zero only. Now, the reason thin provisioning is one of the massive benefits of VMware or virtualization, and one of the benefits you can realize through it. The fact that you couldn't use that, or you couldn't use lazy zeroed virtual disks, was a problem. You could not hot configure fault tolerance. Sorry, it says HT, I should say FT. So if a virtual machine was running, you couldn't turn on fault tolerance on the fly. You had to shut the virtual machine down, go and configure fault tolerance, and turn it back on. Hardware virtualization, there was very limited or almost no support for it. You couldn't take backups or snapshots of the virtual hard disks, the VMDK files. There was no support for power virtualized devices, and there was no storage redundancy. Now, all that has changed under vSphere 6. So you have 4 virtual CPUs, which is a much bigger workload. You can have any kind of virtual disks. You can hot configure fault tolerance. So you can have a virtual machine running a workload and decide, you know what, I need to add fault tolerance to this. I need the added layer of protection that fault tolerance gives me. I can do this here. And you could turn it on without interrupting the workload. Hardware virtualization is supported. You can take backups and snapshots. Previously, the disks were not persistent, and therefore you could not go and actually take backups or snapshots of the virtual machine. In order to back up the virtual machine, you had to either do the backups inside the virtual machine using a backup agent that ran inside the guest operating system, or you had to shut the virtual machine down in order to take a snapshot of it. There was no support for parallel virtualized devices, such as the parallel virtualized SCSI driver, the parallel virtualized network drivers, and they are both devices that you should always try to use if you can, because they give you better performance. And there was no storage redundancy. You could not split or move the virtual machine or its storage around between storage locations without shutting it down. So it was, the limitations on it were very severe. And those have been relaxed greatly. You couldn't use Veeam. license for 5.5, and we'll talk about licensing in a minute. I'll answer that now. If you have support, you can upgrade. So fault tolerance is a feature in vCenter, so there is no fault tolerance without vCenter. You can't do it on a plain ESXi host. And the way fault tolerance works is it effectively runs a copy of the virtual machine up somewhere else. So the way it used to work was that although the memory footprint and the processing footprint was run up on another host, and again you want to do it on another host obviously, because otherwise if you have a virtual host failure and both of your copies are on one virtual host, then there's no point. vCenter is the management platform. The single physical server is ESXi, so you could not run fault tolerance on a single ESXi host on its own. You need vCenter as a function that vCenter provides. But you then need multiple hosts to make use of it, because what fault tolerance does is it runs a copy of a virtual machine up on a separate physical host. I'm not going to answer what fault tolerance is. You're going to have to go do some reading. I won't give a detailed answer. What it is, it's running up a second copy of a virtual machine, so if the first one fails, the second one is immediately available. It is different to high availability, which if a virtual machine host crashes, or if a host with a virtual machine on it crashes, the virtual machine is brought up as if it crashed on another host. Identical physical hardware? No, as long as the machines are in a cluster, it will work. If vCenter crashes, most of the things keep running. There's an amount of autonomy provided to the ESXi hosts. They are told go do certain things under certain conditions by vCenter. vCenter is used to continually ensure that those instructions are correct.
We're getting quite a few comments about learn.itmasters page being a bit unavailable. IT staff have been alerted to this fact, and we're looking into that now. As for questions, we're getting literally dozens of questions, more questions than we can answer. So we will just sort of focus on what the lecture is.
Yeah, guys, what it's
to be about.
I'm happy
to.
If you, sorry, go on, guy. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions in the forums, guys. More than happy. So if the question doesn't immediately respond to this, then yeah, do let me know and we'll go from there.
Robert, I'm not sure if you're available after the lecture finishes. But
I'm more than happy.
Maybe we could just have 5 or 10 minutes after the slated finishing time, and if there's any further questions for people that just really want to get located, then we can answer them then. But if there's basically any questions that are outside the scope of this lecture, I think we should maybe just focus on finishing the lecture on time.
All right, all right, yeah, because we are starting to run. We're almost halfway and we're only about a quarter of the way through. So I'll move on. So fault tolerance, as I said, it's bringing up a second copy of the virtual machine in lockstep, and lockstep is the term that VMware use, that if a change occurs on the primary copy, a change occurs on the fault tolerance copy. So that if for some reason the primary copy crashes, the second copy is immediately available, there is effectively no outage. Okay, so changes to the vCenter server appliance, and I'll get to I'll comment more on this in a future slide. So there was a limitation. So the vCenter server appliance was introduced, I believe, under 5.1, and it's a Linux box. It's SLES 11. Virtual machine or an appliance. Traditionally, vCenter has run as a Windows application or a Windows server application, so you needed to run it up on a Windows virtual machine. VMware for quite some time were criticized by some for being a very Windows-centric or having a very Windows-centric product suite. vCenter had to run on Windows. The VMware client or the vSphere client only ran on Windows. The C# thick client only ran on Windows, and they've gradually been moving away from that. So one of the moves away from that has been the web client, and that's been gradually improving over the versions. Another improvement with that was the introduction of the vCenter server appliance, and again the first version of it was not very stable. and it didn't perform very well. It was very limited, and in fact they released it. They said we really wouldn't advise you actually run this in production. Under 5.5 they said, look, we've made it a lot better. There are still some limitations. So looking at this, so the number of hosts per cluster on vCenter for Windows was 1,000, right, under 5.5 or 6. On the VCSA, which is the nickname for the server appliance, under 5.5, the number of hosts per cluster was limited to 100. Under the VCSA on version 6, it is now 1,000. It has achieved equality with the Windows version. The number of powered-on virtual machines per vCenter, 10,000 on vCenter for Windows. On the VCSA is a vCenter server appliance. It is a copy of vCenter that runs as a Linux appliance rather than running as a server application on Windows. It's the central management tool for the vSphere suite. So under vCenter for Windows, so if you ran vCenter on a 64-bit Windows platform, the number of powered-on VMs you could have in vCenter was 10,000. I'll get to link mode in a moment. Under 5.5, you can only have 3,000 in the cluster. Under 6, it's back to 10,000 under VCSA. So again, it's reached equality with Windows. The number of hosts per cluster has been 64 all the time. That was not no, VCSA is the vCenter server appliance. The web client is the way you interface with vCenter. The virtual machines per cluster.
Just a quick note.
Yep.
Sorry, Robert. Just a quick note. When you are answering a question, don't forget to read out the question because the other students can't see it.
Okay. Yep. My bad. I shall make an effort to do that. Sorry. Thank you. So the number of virtual machines per cluster was always the same. It was 8,000. Well, not always, but certainly under 5.5 and now 6, it has been 8,000. Linked mode. So linked mode is where you can have multiple vCenter servers consuming a single sign-on service from what they used to call a platform services, or what is called a platform services controller under vSphere 6. Under 5.5, I think they just called it the SSO service. So what that means is you can have multiple vCenter servers that share some data. So they share common sign-on across them, but they also share some other information between them. So there's been a question, the VCA version 6, does it still have a web client or is it a client on the appliance as well? It has both, and it's the same for the vCenter on Windows. There is the web interface for it, which VMware are pushing as the primary interface more and more. Under vCenter 6 Update 2, they actually merged VMware Update Manager into the web client. It was not included in the web client previously to that, so you had to run you had to run up a Windows virtual machine to install Update Manager, and you had to go back to the C#. You had to go back to the C# thick client in order to run Update Manager. That's all been merged into the web client. Someone has asked about PSCSI or Para-Virtualized SCSI. I assume that means it is a Para-Virtualized SCSI driver that allows higher performance in a virtual machine for accessing disk or SCSI calls. As a question, can I install or set up vCenter server on an ESXi host? Yes, you can. You can either download the VCSA appliance and run it there, or you can install a Windows virtual machine and then install it into that virtual machine. It used to be, under very early versions of vSphere, that they recommended you ran vCenter on a physical host. That is no longer recommended, and in fact it is not recommended that you run it on a physical host. It's now recommended you gain the benefits of virtualization for vCenter. So there's been a question, are there options that you can't see in the C# client versus the web client? The answer is yes, there are. There are some of the virtual hardware or the VM hardware versions. You can't change a virtual DVD or CD drive on a version 10 or version 11 virtual machine under the thick client. You have to go back to the web client to do it. There are certain changes you can't make to the hardware configuration. Can you vMotion a VCSA between hosts is a question. Absolutely you can. Is the VCSA 6 separately licensed? You license vCenter and you can choose, or as part of the vSphere suite, you get a license for vCenter and you can choose which version you run. Does the VCSA come as a VM image? Yes, it does. You download it as a virtual appliance, as an OVA, and you install it. Now, I will move on because we need to keep going. Okay, so improvements to link mode, and I mentioned there were some improvements to link mode before. So Windows vCenter support under both. VCSA support. Now, linked mode was not supported under the VCSA on 5.5. It is supported now under vSphere 6. So you can actually run linked mode vCenter using VCSAs, where you could not do that before. The single inventory view is common. You've always had that. You've been able to look and you can have a list and you can have your multiple vCenter servers and you can expand them out and see what the configuration, what the inventory was under each one of them. Single inventory search, again, the same. You could search your inventory for certain things. The replication technology. So under vSphere 5.5, Microsoft ADAM was used, or ADAM, was used as the replication of data between vCenter servers and to share data with the SSO server. That has been changed, and one of the reasons why you could not do linked mode under the VCSA on 5.5 was because they couldn't use Microsoft ADAM under the VCSA Linux environment. Because they have now moved the replication to be a VMware native replication technology, they've included it in the vCenter server appliance. Roles and permissions licensing were both common on 5.5 and 6 under linked mode. Policies, you could not have policy definitions were not shared across the environments in linked mode. Under 5.5, they now are under version 6. And tagging was not possible. So you can actually add metadata tags, which you can search by, sort by, things like that to your virtual machines. And that was not possible under linked mode on 5.5. That has been added for version 6. Improvements to networking also came. So network I/O control was added. Basically, that allowed you to, on a per VM basis, reserve bandwidth on your distributed vSwitches. Multicast snooping was added to distributed vSwitches as well. So the ability to go and snoop on multicast traffic within your environments to see what's going on. There is also, as I mentioned earlier, a dedicated TCP/IP stack for vMotion. So that allows discrete management of your vMotion traffic, including a dedicated default gateway. And as I mentioned earlier, that was previously shared with all VM kernel networking. So another thing that was introduced under version 6 was virtual volumes, or vVols. So vVols took the concept of software-defined, which they'd already done for virtual machines. So compute and RAM had already been effectively moved to a software-defined paradigm. So they have now moved storage into that as well. So what it does, so it allows you to leverage your existing investment in block storage, SCSI, iSCSI, fiber channel over Ethernet. But what it does is, rather than you presenting a LUN from your storage, or a LUN, a logical unit number, or a particular configuration of storage, and again, go look at my storage primer because that gives some information on this, and you would present that LUN from your storage platform to VMware or to vCenter, and it had a particular capability, and you were locked to that capability for that LUN. And when you created your virtual machines, you created their virtual storage in that LUN, and that virtual machine was tied to the LUN that you decided to drop it into. What vVols allow is a much more highly granular control of storage capability. So when you create a virtual machine, you can actually create vVol configurations that say the operating system disk for each one of my virtual machines needs to have these particular capabilities. So it doesn't need to be particularly fast, but I don't want it to be on the slowest. I can then have a vVol definition for bulk storage, or for file servers as an example. I can have a vVol definition for log drives, for SQL servers. I can have these different definitions of storage. So what is the I/O capability and what is the level of redundancy or protection in this particular storage? And when I create a virtual machine, instead of saying just drop all my virtual machines into these VMFS volumes, which sit on LUNs, I can say this virtual machine needs this capability for this drive, this capability for the second drive, and this capability for the third drive. Go and provision that for me. And what you got was a series of storage. What you get is a series of storage containers, or a container that is made up of different types of storage or types of storage capability assigned to the virtual machine. Effectively, each virtual machine gets its own slice of storage. Instead of using a large volume or a large LUN, which then had multiple virtual machines sitting in it, what you end up with is that each virtual machine has its own dedicated storage allocation. I don't know if storage I/O control is allowed on vVols, to be honest. Funnily enough, so somebody asked, do vVols allow storage I/O control? Glenn has asked, does that mean VMware can now effectively manage storage itself? It actually pushes the management back to the storage device. Storage devices are really good at storage, and they're really good at provisioning storage and providing storage at different levels. VMFS and VMware itself wasn't so crash-hot at it. It was pretty good, but in the end, so what happened, and there's some changes to the VASA, or the VMware APIs for storage, that instead of VMware or your vCenter server saying to your storage, go and delete this block and delete this block and delete this block and delete this block, it says, I want you to delete blocks 1 to 15, tell me when you're done. And it just happens. So it's really offloading a lot of the work that gets done by storage to storage. Is vVols limited by vSphere License Edition? It's certainly present in Enterprise and Enterprise Plus. I'm not sure if it's in Standard, noting that I'll talk about in a minute about licenses where the Enterprise license is actually going or has gone. So how does an SDK-aware SAN snap handle VMs spanned across different arrays? That's probably getting pretty deep, Jeff. It's something we'll probably discuss offline if it's okay, because there are ways and there are limitations. Vishal has mentioned in 5.5 renaming of VMs on the fly was allowed, but in 6 it's changed. It still works in 6. I did it today actually. There are different things you need to do. There are changes to the interface, especially if you've moved from the C# interface to the web client, but what does happen if you rename a virtual machine, it doesn't rename the underlying storage allocations. So if you have stored a virtual machine in volume 1 and you called your virtual machine Fred, what happened was a folder called Fred was created on your storage volume, and all the files that made up that virtual machine, the VMX file, the VMDK files, things like that, were dumped in there, and they had names based around the name Fred. Now if you went and changed the name of that virtual machine in the GUI from Fred to Timothy, what happened was that although the name appeared to be different in the interface, the client interface that you saw, the underlying file names didn't change unless you went and then did a storage vMotion on the virtual machine. And when you do a storage vMotion, the new folders that are created, the new files that are created, are based on the name of the virtual machine at that time. So certainly it was good practice that if you renamed a virtual machine, you should also go and move its storage allocations around to ensure that the file names matched the name of the virtual machine, because otherwise it became very easy to not know which files were related to which virtual machine. You could then go use VMKFS tools, that is correct, to rename the files, but most people didn't bother. The VCSA, there are low-level licenses for it. There is a Essentials package which is quite cheap, which includes vCenter standard, and you can get vCenter as a VCSA or the Windows edition. Back to the virtual volumes though. So the idea is you're offloading your storage workload to the storage provider, or the SAN or your storage appliance, because that's what they're good at. And what it does, and in the end, it allows greater storage self-service from VMware admins. So whereas before, especially if you worked in a siloed environment, if you were a VMware admin and you needed to create a new virtual machine and you didn't have enough storage to do so, you had to go, or enough allocated storage to do so. So the SAN had plenty of free space on it, but it hadn't been allocated to you. You had to go to your storage people and say, hey, can I have another volume, please, because I need to create new virtual machines. Under vVols, you go and create your virtual machine, and the storage is automatically allocated to you based on the rules that have been created. So other enhancements that came under vSphere 6, so there's a content library. So whereas before you may have kept your ISO images and your templates in particular locations, under vSphere 6 there's now a centralized content library which actually tracks all that. So you can go to one place to find those commonly used items. Enhanced user interface, the web client improved, it got faster and less buggy. As of vCenter 6.0 update 1, I thought it was update 2, but it's update 1, I apologize for that before. Update Manager is now integrated with the web client. That was not the case before. So as I mentioned before, you had to use the web client for some things and you had to use the C# or the FAT client or thick client for others. Update Manager was one of those things, those other things you had to use the thick client for. That's no longer the case, and it's certainly not the case under 6.5. The old C# or FAT or thick client is still present, although there's some things you cannot do. You can't do vVols, you can't do vSAN, and you can't manage higher level hardware versions or virtual hardware versions. Licensing changes. So there were previously, other than the Essentials packages, which are a little bit different, and the accelerators, which were kind of a licensing upgrade, you had vSphere Essentials and Essentials Plus, and I put them in here. So it should actually say 7, not 6. So you had vSphere Standard, Enterprise Plus, vSphere with Operations Manager Enterprise Plus, vSphere Enterprise, vSphere with Operations Manager Standard, and vSphere with Operations Manager Enterprise. So basically vSphere, Standard, Enterprise, or Enterprise Plus, and there was also a version that also came with Operations Manager. Now the Enterprise product has been dropped entirely. So vSphere Enterprise and vSphere with Operations Manager Enterprise, gone. And they also decided that people didn't need Operations Manager if you had standard vCenter. So they've really reduced the number of products. Now, one of the reasons they've done that is that they are really focusing very heavily on vCloud and on things like the vCloud management products and things like that, and cloud services. You may have heard recently announced a massive partnership with AWS for their public cloud solutions. So they've dropped the number of tools here. And one of the things that they decided was that there weren't a lot of people using Enterprise who weren't actually using the Enterprise Plus feature set. And the cost of upgrading from Enterprise to Enterprise Plus is much lower than the cost of upgrading from Standard to Enterprise. Operations Manager is basically a set of tools cobbled together that allow you to automate and certain functionality and do some reporting and things like that on top of vCenter. So vCenter has relatively little built-in automation and reporting. Ops Manager enhanced that quite a bit. As I mentioned, the last three are no longer for sale. So Enterprise, Operations Manager over Standard or Enterprise, all gone. You can no longer buy them. Support is available for them though until 2020. Essentials limits you to 3 hosts with 2 CPUs each. The question was, what's the difference between Essentials and Standard? Standard has a limitation. You don't get some of the extra features. Essentials is really a smaller version of it that is limited. It's only about $1,000. It's actually very cheap. There's been a question about upgrading from 5.5 Enterprise. You need to go to Enterprise Plus when the time comes. Support includes the maintenance packages. If you have a current maintenance package on 5.5 Enterprise, that will remain available for you until 2020. So you might go to 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5 before we get to 2020. And that package set and that set of pricing will still be available for you as somebody who's already bought vSphere Enterprise. So the question was, will Enterprise be available? Or will you need to upgrade to Enterprise Plus? But until 2020, you'll be able to maintain the current licensing you have. So we start looking at vCenter Server, and there's only 6 slides after this one, guys. So we're going to finish probably a little bit late, but not too bad. So as we mentioned before, I've probably gone through a bit of this already, so we can get through it fairly quickly. So vCenter is a set of components that are used to manage the vSphere environment. The 2 key components of vCenter are the Platform Services Controller. I will answer Andrew's question just to give you an idea. So Essentials was around $1,000. It might be more in Australian dollars versus US dollars. He's asked if Essentials is $1,000, how much is Enterprise Plus? Enterprise Plus is about $5,000 per CPU socket, and the licensing, I believe, there you go, 6,500. Somebody's answered. That's per CPU socket. So in a quad socket server, you were looking at paying $26,000. Essentials, there you go. So Nathaniel's Essentials was $800 Australian, Essentials plus $2,500 Australian. Those prices have increased, yet there's significant jumps, but you get much more features. In the move to that new pricing, the cost per CPU core went up, or per CPU, sorry, per CPU socket went up from about 5,500 to 6,500 per CPU as well. So not only did they reduce the number of products on the market, they upped the prices of them as well. So I'll get back to the slide because again I don't want to run too late. So the two key components of vCenter that make up the vCenter services is the platform services controller. So that provides the single sign-on environment, the licensing service, so it manages your licenses for it, the lookup service, which allows you to do your searching, the directory service, which lists all the different objects in their hierarchies. It also includes the, oh, something terrible has just happened, I do apologize. There we go. I lost my page. I do apologize. The certificate authority as well. So that's a the VMware certificate authority allows you to publish your own SSL certificates within the environment. You can actually make the certificate authority a subordinate of your enterprise CA in your Windows environment, as an example, and issue certificates that your client machines all natively recognize. Or you can have self-signed out of the VMware certificate authority certificates, and you just have to accept that they're not signed by a known authority that you trust them. So that allows you to encrypt the management traffic and some of the other traffic that occurs between components of your vSphere environment. The vCenter server itself then includes the vCenter server, as I mentioned. The vSphere web client runs off the vCenter server. The inventory service, which then keeps a track of all the inventory within the VMware environment. Your auto deploy service, which allows you to deploy various things in the environment. Your ESXi dump collector, so there is a service that will actually collect the dump. Any crash dumps that occur from ESXi will be sent to vCenter. And also there's a vSphere syslog collector or a syslog service, depending on whether you're running the Windows or the VCSA version of vCenter. Other components such as Update Manager and also Site Recovery Manager are installed separately. They required, I say required because it's changing under 6.5, a separate virtual machine to have them installed. So to install Update Manager, you actually had to run up another Windows box and then install Update Manager into that. Update Manager also required a SQL database or an Oracle database. You could not install it and say go and use the embedded Postgres database on the VCSA. So the VCSA, and I think I'll probably talk about it here, but the VCSA uses an embedded Postgres database. So when you're deploying vCenter, and I've said this here for version 6, and it's certainly even more critical on 6.5 because that's all that's there, unless you really need to use the Windows vCenter server, and there are some environments under which you do need to use it. You know, if you have a corporate policy that certain types of data must be stored in an Oracle or a Microsoft SQL database server, then you need to use the Windows vCenter server up until 6.5. So unless you have those requirements though, deploy the VCSA. It's simpler, it's smaller, you save a Windows license unless you're running Windows data center licenses on your VMware environment, which is not something I'll touch on right now, but it's an option for some people. The VCSA, it's just easier, it's much more stable than it used to be. And as of vCenter 6 Update 2, the C# client is technically no longer required for native vSphere functionality. You can use the web client. That's things like Update Manager. There's a few other minor little bits and pieces that have been merged into the Windows, from the Windows client, sorry, to the web client. Now there are two primary deployment options, and there are variations thereof, but really the two deployment options are that you can have a vCenter server with the PSC, the Platform Service Controller, embedded. One virtual machine does the lot. In smaller environments, that's probably okay. In larger environments, and there was a question earlier about why you might run linked mode. And certainly you can't run linked mode if you're running your vCenter and your PSC on the same environment. The whole idea of linked mode is it gives you multiple vCenter servers, and reasons you might do that are that you are running a distributed environment where you might have data centers in different countries, and for performance, manageability, and various other reasons, you want to run a separate vCenter server in each country, but overall you want your IT team to have full visibility and functionality across all of the environments. There's some reasons why you might run linked mode. The VCSA, someone has asked, can we install VCSA on a physical server or only provided as an OVA? It is only provided as an OVA. It is a virtual appliance, that's all it is. Someone has asked, is there a migration path from Windows to the vCenter to the VCSA under 6.5? Yes, there is. I'll get to that in a minute. There are unsupported ways of doing it. There is now a supported way of doing it. Do you need to install Update Manager on each vCenter server? You don't install it on the vCenter server, you install it separately, and you generally need one Update Manager per vCenter server, yes. Can you export OVAs to VMs to OVAs? Yes, some of them. I shall keep going. Okay, so the topology options you get, and they're described, this is the installation screen when you deploy your virtual center server appliance. So it asks you, do you want to deploy with an embedded services controller? And you can see the image here. I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse moving around. But you have a single VM, and the platform services controller and vCenter are embedded within that single VM. So it's a single standalone environment, no redundancy, no high performance. That's just the way it is. Or you have the external services controller, where you have a VM that has the platform services controller installed on it, and then you have vCenter server installed on one or more other virtual machines. Good, you can see the mouse. So down here. And so in the environment I work in right now, we have a single platform services controller that is responsible for all of Asia Pacific, and I have a virtual VCSA. Yet a VCSA, it will be, sorry, it's currently a VM, a Windows VM, in each of the major countries where we have a major data center. So the local IT team have direct access to a vCenter server, but we are sharing configuration and log-on data across the team. Is split deployment of VCSA or vCenter covered by one vCenter license? No, you need one license per server. It's funny, someone who's just asked, can we have two PSCs for redundancy? It is a single point of failure, and it is a bit of a scary one. So this is some of now I've already mentioned this deployment option where you've got a single platform services controller and multiple vCenter servers, right? That's a fairly standard, but how do you provide protection to your platform services controller given that it hosts your SSO domain? There are ways. So you can have an active-active replicated cluster of PSCs. And then you can then use a load balancer between your vCenter servers, and you can have them clustered and have them then talking through that load balancer to your redundant platform services controllers. And this is one of the ways that vCenter or VMware recommended that you did this, that your PSCs replicated data between each other so they maintained a consistent view, and that if one of them failed, then the other one kept going, and your load balancer would deal with the way your vCenter servers talk to it. The PSC is not a separate cost of vCenter, no. It's included as part of the vCenter solution. It's just a separate component of it. Can the PSCs replicate over a routed network? I believe they can. In a cluster topology, how does the cluster bootstrap itself if everything is powered down at the same time? Yeah, there's a little bit of manual intervention required occasionally, because sometimes you need to have the platform services controller up before you bring Virtual Center up. There can be some issues with that, yes. No, the PSC does not have to reside in the same layer 2 or broadcast domain as has been asked. I have a PSC in Sydney, and I have Virtual Center servers in countries outside of Australia, and so they are definitely not in the same layer 2 or broadcast domain, but it is routed traffic between the two. Jeff has asked, sorry, he means that for clustering. I don't believe so. I think the clustering can be done across layer 3 as well. So Update Manager, it's one of the components. Although it's fully integrated into the vSphere web client as of 6.0 Update 2, you still need to install it as a separate installation. So it does not install onto your vCenter server or your platform services controller. It's a separate installation. You must install it on Windows 64-bit. There was no option. That was it. I'll say again was, because I'm about to talk about that in a moment. So the SQL Oracle databases are required. You cannot use this, and I mentioned this already, with the Postgres database that is installed as part of the VCSA. It simply doesn't work. The VCSA is the only thing that can talk to the embedded database within the VCSA. And by the same token, if you install vCenter onto Windows, you're given the option of using an embedded database or an external SQL or Oracle database. And again, if you use the embedded database, nothing else can talk to it. Question's been asked, how does that affect upgrades from 5.5 with VUM installed on the vCenter? You just need to be careful with it, but again, under 6.5, there is supported upgrade paths from 5.5 and 6. And we'll get to that in a moment. Now, to set up your lab, as I said, we're almost finished. So, you can download the vSphere software from VMware. This list, I've published these URLs on the forums. The slide deck is already up on the forums, and you'll also get the recording, so you'll get to see all this. So you download that from VMware. You will need to register or log on. You need to log on. You need to register. It allows you a 60-day trial of the vSphere components. That should be enough for this course and for you to have a play. If you have access to education licensing, or you think that running an essentials package meets your requirements and you can justify the cost, great, because it can be really nice to play with, especially if you're going to do some formal learning and some exams on the product. Now, the installation options for ESXi and all the other components can be run as VMs. I think VirtualBox has been documented as working. Someone's asking to use VirtualBox, possibly, as a host for ESXi. So one of the things you're looking at doing is you're looking at running your virtualization on top of another application. There are some issues with running nested virtualization. There are some functionality of the CPU that you need to expose to the virtual machine in order for this to work. So if you do it through VMware Workstation Player, and there's a link there for that, you download it and it's free for personal or educational use. You don't get the Pro version for free, but you get the standard version. You can run up a ESXi install in that with default settings. In fact, if you point it, if you go to create a virtual machine and you point it at the ISO for ESXi, it will recognize that it's ESXi and set it up for you. The labs at VMware are another option if you can gain access to them. Certainly there are lots of ways of doing this. What I've given is a couple of options to do this here. You can also do it under Hyper-V, and the site I've linked to there gives you the instructions, including how to expose the virtualization functionality of your underlying CPUs to your virtual machine. Because by default, most of the virtualization products don't expose those things. You can also do it if you're a Mac user on VMware Fusion. Now again, this is not an exhaustive list, and certainly there are some other options available, but this is to give what I thought would be the majority of people a good go at getting up and getting started. You will need some RAM and some disk. You know, my personal machine at home has 32 gig of RAM because I know I'm going to run virtualization on it. So I'm running Windows 10, and then I'm running VMware Workstation Player on top of it. And that's enough for what I do. I can run a couple of 4 gig or 8 gig VMs and still have room left over in my RAM. So vSphere 6.5, and I said I wanted to talk about it. It's 9:03, so we haven't done too badly. Okay, officially released 18th of October 2016, or yesterday. The main changes. So the VCSA has become the absolute focus. Can't confirm it, but I'm not seeing any information that there is a vCenter server for Windows anymore. I've only looked at this briefly. I'm not claiming to be an expert on the new product. I can say that I was not on the closed beta and therefore did not have access to information about this until yesterday. There were a lot of guesses floating around on the internet about it, but if you were in the closed beta, you were restricted by a fairly strong NDA, and so a lot of this information did not get out until yesterday. However, there is now native VCSA high availability functionality built in. This is native and it's supported. The tools there are tools now, and I mentioned this before, there are tools that allow for the supported migration of the previous versions of the VCSA, and that's 5.5 and 6, and vCenter on Windows. There is a direct path from them both. In terms of the lab setup, I would recommend you set up, and I'm going to put some stuff in the forums, you run up an ESXi server, and then on that you run up a VM with vCenter server. That will be enough to get you going right now. And then you might want to run up a couple of VMs and start playing. But that's enough for now. Get a feel for it, see how it works. On ESXi, there is also an embedded HTML5 management platform available to manage just the ESXi server itself, because you might need to do that in order to then go and create your virtual machine. So certainly there's some information. Again, I'll post that in the forums. Back to 6.5 though. VMware are claiming, and it's let's see how those claims go. There is a 2-time increase in scale and a 3-time increase in performance. Remembering that those scale figures had already jumped up fairly significantly from 5.5. They have moved to what they call an API-first focus for tools and add-ons. So they're providing APIs, a lot of APIs, and VMware have been getting better at that, and that they're producing more of them. And really, they're also eating their own dog food here. Their own tools are consuming the APIs they're publishing. Install 6 for this. We're not talking about 6.5 yet. And this course is version 6, not 6.5, or 6.0 if you want to be technical. 6.5, it's too new. There's no information out there. No one other than the people in the beta, which I was not part of, have had significant enough exposure to it to provide any level of education on it. 12.5 is what you use for free. Pro is what you get if you pay for it. Yeah, I'll publish updated slides on the website. Somebody's asked about that and asked should they use Workstation Pro or Player 12.5. I use Player 12.5. Pro costs money. It's not cheap. Back to the slide. They have introduced VM level disk encryption and encrypted vMotion traffic. There is quite a lot of commentary around the fact that vMotion traffic was not secure, and especially if you were starting to do it between data centers or between private and public cloud or on-site and cloud. Yeah, there were some concerns over that. That's now encrypted. That traffic is encrypted. The HTML5 vSphere client, and somebody mentioned earlier before about the fling. So there was a fling, and the flings are the, I guess you call it public beta pieces of software that VMware released. They don't support it fully, but it's there and you can use it, and it's not necessarily fully functional at the time, and they're updated very regularly. So that HTML5 client has become production. It does everything you need to do in this environment. As far as I can tell, there is no C# client anymore. It's all done in this. Will encryption cause performance issues? It always causes there's always a performance hit on encryption. It depends on how significant it is. I don't know how significant it will become. I don't know if it's the default for disks and vMotion. And the quality of the logging has improved. So the logs previously have been a little bit hit and miss. They didn't have, if you had an auditor come in and say, I want to see exactly who did what, when and why in the system, the logs that VMware provided made it difficult to get some of that information, and some of it simply wasn't there. The level of logging has been improved. Someone's asked, does the logging now meet PCI and FIPS and or FIPS? I don't know. I don't know exactly what they're saying. It's audit level or audit quality. I don't know what level of audit they're asking for or what they're offering. The Flash-based web client is hopefully gone completely, and hopefully they've burnt it and then resurrected it and then shot it and then resurrected it and burnt it again. It was horrible, even for a Windows person, and it meant that people on Mac, and people on other platforms struggled with it. The web client is dead. Long live the web client. It was worse than the fat client. Absolutely, it wasn't stable. It was horrid. Personal opinion. Don't quote me on that. Quote me, but quote me personally, not as representing any other organisation. But it was horrible. I don't know if someone's asked, is it still utilizing Java? I don't know. I don't know what's in it yet. I haven't run it up myself. Certificates are all the certificates that someone's asked, are all certificates managed through this single sign-on? So all the certificates in vSphere are managed by the certificate authority, or the vSphere certificate authority, which is installed on the platform services controller. And it will issue certificates to your hosts as they're brought on board. It issues certificates to them. Your client will be asked to trust those certificates. Somebody's asked, is the taking backup? Look, before I answer any more questions, here we go, questions. All right, so those of you who just wanted to attend for the content, it's done. The recording of this will go out. For anybody who wants to hang around and ask more questions, I'll try to get to all of them that I can. I'm happy to spend...
There are many questions.
I'm happy to spend some time.
Yeah.
So what I'll do, I've just been watching the questions flick through. I'm actually going to undock my questions. I'm going to make it really big. And
there's a few that have been red flagged, but they're honestly, from throughout the session, so some may or may not still be relevant.
That's cool. Now, so I'm going to be minorly silly. I see a green flag column.
Yep, there should be green and red.
I'm seeing ticks or green. I'm not seeing anything else.
Okay, at the bottom of the green there'll be some other colours. One question while we're waiting is, I think it came from Jet.
Yep.
One question was, would you recommend swapping over to 6.5 now, or would you recommend waiting?
No. My default advice and the practice that I follow myself is that I will always wait for update 1. Now, 6.5 has been floating around in the background for a while. VMworld this year was run on it, so yeah, they're eating their own dog food. They're really focusing on if it's good enough for them, or if they're expecting it to be good enough for us, they're saying it's good enough for them as well. They are following that, but yeah, I'm always cautious of running version 0 software, anything .0. VMware tend to push updates, so update 1 shouldn't take too long to come out, especially if there's bugs. I would not go straight to 6.5 for production. If you've got lab environments, great, run it up, play with it, break it, tell VMware where you broke it. They will be happy to hear it, because that means update 1 will fix those problems. Okay, so looking through some of these questions. Do the enhancements negate the need for SRM? No. No. So Site Recovery Manager is about automating the replication of virtual machines from one site to another. It includes the ability to automate not only the virtual machine operations but also the storage operations, and in fact what it tends to do is do storage level snapshots of virtual machines and then copy those snapshots between arrays. That can be done, certainly originally you had to have the same array or the same technologies on either side. Later that was done at the VMDK level rather than the storage layer, but certainly it's about replicating virtual machines from one site to another in order to do a site recovery or a disaster recovery event effectively. And what it does, it automates a lot of those functionalities. So you tell it which virtual machines you want protected, you tell it how often you want them replicated, so it gives you an idea of what your recovery point objectives are. I think the shortest you can go is 15 minutes. And then when you have a failover, you go and tell it, right, so if you have a failure, you say, right, go do a failover, please. And it automates bringing up the VMs in the new site, and there's some orchestration around. It might go change their IP addresses or rename them or do certain things so that your workloads are brought up ready to go without a lot of manual intervention. Another really nice thing it can do is you can test your DR by saying, do a failover into a sandbox. And it sandboxes the whole environment and runs it as an isolated environment so that you can go and actually run it up and see, does all this planning and testing I've done or configuration done actually work? And you can actually document that as well. So it's really good for proving you can do your DR. So some of the enhancements to the vCenter product actually enhance that. They don't just add functionality outside of SRM. SRM is still a really nice product. I've used it in anger, and I was really impressed with its capabilities. You never want to you never want to have to use it, but it's nice to have it when you need it. So another question, is it true that if we create thin provision disks, it will not create the provision column in the data store browser? Okay, so if you thick provision your disks, you don't get the provisioned column. You simply get the size column. If you thin provision, you get two columns. You get one column that indicates how big the disk can get in theory, and you get another column to say how much space it's really consumed. And it gets worse because you see that as the VMDK file in the GUI. If you go to the command line and start looking at the file structures, you're actually seeing a slightly different view. There's files called _flat and files that indicate different. Your VMDK as a logical construct, as far as the GUI is involved, is actually made up of separate files underneath. So yeah, if you thin provision, you get 2 columns. If you thick provision, you only get 1. So a question, are there some timing estimates between the current active and lockstep copy? Look, is it limited on network latency? It's limited by latency and how much change is occurring. They have a target. I don't remember exactly what that target is offhand, but it is one of the reasons that under 5.5 that fault tolerance was limited to only 1 CPU core, and some of those limitations in order to maintain lockstep. Excuse me. So they had significant improvements under version 6, and they were allowed to, in that case, migrate more data successfully between virtual machines. One of the things they enhanced, and I didn't mention it specifically during the lecture, was that under 5.5 there was only 1 set of VMDK files for the virtual machine and the fault-tolerant copy. So although you had the memory and the CPU footprint running on 2 hosts, there was only 1 copy of the storage. So if your reason for failure was that the storage device that your primary copy was sitting on had failed, your secondary copy was also dead straight away. There was no escaping that. Under version 6, it actually keeps a secondary copy of the storage. So you have a second set of VMDK files. The really good thing about this is what it means is you could actually, if you really wanted to, and in some examples or circumstances, it would be warranted, you could actually go and store the fault-tolerant protected virtual machine on local storage to the host to protect it from shared storage failure. And what that meant was that if the host failed, its underlying storage would obviously fail with it because it's attached directly to the host, but your fault-tolerant copy was sitting in a separate storage location, separate to your shared storage. Or you can actually say, I'll keep my primary copy on shared storage because it's got the performance I want and the protection I want, but my fault-tolerant copy I'll run up on local storage or a separate storage provider, so that if the primary failed, and if the reason your primary copy of your fault-tolerant protected virtual machine failed was that the storage underneath it fell over, your fault-tolerant copy had its storage somewhere else that hopefully had not fallen over. I hope that explains that. Do I recommend to move from vCenter on Windows to the VCSA under 6? It depends how much you are invested in the processes for managing your vCenter on Windows. Now, if you were greenfields, I would say under 6, do it under the VCSA. It makes more sense. It was the direction that VMware were going anyway, and that was obvious from the amount of effort they were putting into the product. Or into the VCSA platform. Certainly when you go to 6.5, you'll need to go to the VCSA as far as I can tell. And again, as I mentioned, there are supported migration processes from either vCenter on Windows or VCSA version 6. So either way it's fine. Unless it is an insignificant amount of work for you to change from the Windows to the VCSA, and unless you expect to see significant benefits, then I'd say don't change. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? So if you're not having problems with it on Windows and it's not costing you money, or you don't need to recoup a Windows license, then I wouldn't say change, no. But knowing that eventually the platform you're going to have to support is going to be the VCSA. Question, does vSphere Update Manager is it needed on multiple vCenter servers in order to apply updates on different vCenters? It doesn't actually update vCenter. It updates your ESXi hosts. I'm fairly sure, and again, I'm 99% sure that you need 1 update manager installed per vCenter. So if you're running multiple vCenter servers, you also need multiple update manager servers. In general, you tend to keep your vCenter servers close to your ESXi hosts, just for management performance. And because Update Manager is pushing software to them, you probably want to keep it that way as well. Update Manager used to be able to update the operating system within your virtual machines if your operating system happened to be Windows. They removed that functionality a while ago. So it doesn't really talk to your VMs these days so much as your ESXi hosts. And you can either update patches or do full upgrades. So you can actually use Update Manager to upgrade an ESXi host from 5.5 to 6. You can do that through Update Manager, and it manages that for you. And it will even manage to a degree putting the host into maintenance mode. Then if you've got DRS and vMotion active in your cluster, your VMs will be migrated to other hosts. It will then apply the patches, reboot the host, and bring it back up in maintenance mode, ready for you to exit maintenance mode. So it's pretty good. A question, why has the tab for snapshots been removed in vSphere 6? Has it? I hadn't noticed. I will go have a look. Certainly you can access them through the context menus in the web client. I'm running the FAT client and hadn't noticed the tab was missing for it. There's a button up the top for snapshot management, along with the open the virtual console and edit the config in the FAT client. I don't honestly remember if the tab has gone missing. Sorry, it's not something I've really noticed. Something I'll go have a look at. Someone's asked what's link mode and why do we need it. I think I've answered that question already. Allows you to have multiple vCenter servers to keep them close to your workloads or your admin teams. And if you're running some of the vSphere APIs for data protection, as an example, the backup application will communicate with your ESXi hosts to talk to them about the jobs it's going to run via vCenter. It will also ask vCenter to kick off the snapshots. So you want to have, well, you don't want to have, to turn it around, a significant amount of latency between your vCenter servers and your backup. A very good question, I touched on it earlier but probably didn't get to it completely, is if I use ESXi version 6 without vCenter, can I use the standard thick client to connect, or do you have to use a web client? You can use the vSphere client to talk to a host directly. However, there is a web client, and I believe it's HTML5, that is available that you can install. You install it from a URL on the ESX. So you log into the command line and you run ESXi, ESXCLI, software update, install. I can't remember the exact command. I'll put it in the forums anyway. But it goes and pulls the VIB file down from VMware and installs it for you, and then you can browse to it with a web client. That's actually quite nice. I think it was actually the precursor to the vCenter web client or the vSphere web client, HTML5 web client. The content library is available in the Essentials version or Essentials/free version. There's only a free version of vCenter if you're running the demo or the trial version, and you're effectively getting the enterprise feature. In fact, I think you get the enterprise plus feature set when you do that for 60 days. ESXi itself, no, there's no content library on ESXi. On vCenter, I believe it might be an Essentials Plus, but not Essentials. I will have to check. Again, I'll try and remember to go comment on that one. I've already answered the question about PCI FIPS compliancy with a new logging. Is there a newer version of Verizon View to match, or is that coming? It is coming. It tends to lag behind vCenter or vSphere. So for those who aren't aware, Horizon View or VDI or VMware View or whatever they're calling it with the next release, they do tend to change the name of this product a bit, is the virtual desktop tool or product. So it allows you to deploy virtual desktops either on thick clients, Windows clients with a piece of client software, or even over thin clients. So it's a virtual desktop infrastructure product that VMware have, and they tend to lag the version of that behind the version of vSphere. Is taking a backup of the VCSA as simple as backing up SQL? No, it's not. You effectively have to take a snapshot copy of the virtual machine and then really hope that the database was consistent. Certainly it's been written to be consistent in that state. Some of the vSphere data protection, vSphere APIs for data protection backup tools possibly manage that a little bit better. Has vSphere 6 resolved the issue of nesting Hyper-V VMs? I don't know actually. I have taken copies of Hyper-V VMs and installed them under vSphere 5.5 and 6, I think. Generally, your Hyper-V VMs are in EUFI mode, or UEFI mode. Sorry, the BIOS. It's not traditional BIOS. It's the UEFI BIOS, and you may have to go and specifically configure your virtual machine after you import the virtual disks to be that BIOS type in order for it to boot. That's certainly what I had to do in the one environment I've had to do that in. In production, should we thin, eager, thick, or lazy thick? Like many questions, the answer to that is it depends. Thin provisioning is great as long as you manage it. And the reason I say that is under thin provisioning, you're effectively saying, I've got a terabyte, let's say, just to use some rough figures, I've got a terabyte of raw disk that I can use, or formatted volume that I can use, and I'm going to create 2 virtual machines on there with up to a terabyte of disk each. So in theory, you're provisioning up to 2 terabytes of disk or of potential consumption onto a 1 terabyte volume. Now obviously 2 does not go into 1 and leave you with an integer as the result. However, what you're counting on then is you'll never actually use 1 terabyte of each of those virtual machines, and in fact on average you'll use no more than 500 gig in each of them. As long as you watch that and manage it, and if you actually find you're using more, you go and provision additional storage before it runs out, that's fine. Because if you run out of storage, your virtual machines freeze. So as long as you manage that, that's fine. Some storage platforms actually prefer that you don't thin provision. So I am currently utilizing in one of the environments I have responsibility for a HP 3PA storage device, all flash. And it has native thin provisioning and deduping built into it. And HP's recommendation, or HP Enterprise, their recommendation is that you do not thin provision your virtual machines in your VMFS volumes, that you eager zero thick provision them, because one of the functionalities that the 3PA has is that it drops 0 blocks, so it doesn't actually write them. It notes they were there and doesn't write them, so it wants you to go write in a 1 terabyte virtual machine effectively a terabyte of zeros, because it then goes, well, I actually don't need to store this, and doesn't store them. And they also recommend, because they're doing dedupe, that you don't thin provision, because thin provisioning reduces their dedupe capability. Now, somebody who is a little bit cynical might suggest they're saying that because that way their figures, when they go and report how much dedupe and thin provisioning they're doing, looks better. But in reality, they are again saying, you know what, we're the storage guys. We write the storage. The storage device that you have is actually really good at storage. Let us do the work. That's what they're saying. You need to be careful with thin provisioning that if you do over provision, and that is one of the benefits of thin provisioning, is that you manage it, because as I mentioned, if your storage volume fills, your virtual machines will freeze. Jerry has asked a question about the snapshot tabs. I don't know, I need to have a look at that. Primary site on 5.5 and DR 5.5 in link mode, and vCenter server at each site with SRM. What's the recommended topology in 6? No, I would look, if you can have multiple PSCs, they will replicate between each other. I would suggest in that instance, my gut feel without having a full diagram, is that you should have a PSC in each site. Now, you may decide that you'll run your PSC in your backup site and back it up really well so that if it falls over, but if you're at the point where you've got 2 sites, I would recommend that under 5.5, I don't think it's actually called a Platform Services Controller. I think they called it an SSO service, but I would recommend, if you can, under 5.5, that you have 1 copy in each site. Under 6, you certainly can. Are there any performance monitoring tools for monitoring the VMs in vSphere? There are some basic tools. So you can, on each VM, go and look at the performance tab under the, and you'll get an idea for how much RAM it's consuming, how much CPU it's consuming, how much disk I/O it's consuming. You can look at that either in real time and or historical values. There are some caveats to that data that you need to be aware of, and if you start looking at virtual machine performance management, you'll start coming across those. But certainly if you want more data than VMware provides, Operations Manager can provide some of that. It also depends on where you want to collect the data. Now, if you want to see what your virtual machine is seeing, you of course then need to go and run your tools within your virtual machine. So you would run some disk performance tools within the virtual machine to see what performance is the workload actually receiving from the virtual machine. If you're more concerned about how your storage array was running, you'd probably want to go run the tools at your storage array level. Where you run your performance management tools really depends on what performance you're trying to manage and monitor. David, you've asked, is this the equivalent of official VMware course? No, it's not. This is not a certified course. It will not allow you to go and take VMware exams based on attending this course. I can, however, say that the IT Masters / CSU course can include a VMware subject, which I taught this year, which does qualify you for that. A question on homework. The homework really is to go set up your lab. As I mentioned, really you want to run up an ESXi host or virtual machine in a lab and at least run up vCenter and start playing with the both of them to get a feel for them. That's really all I'm going to ask that people do this week. If you've got access to that environment already at work, great, become familiar with it. But if you don't, then the tools to do so, or some of the tools to do so, I've included details for already.
And just on that, Robert, we're having a few issues with the IT Masters webpage just at the moment. IT people are on the look at that right now.
Cool.
But yeah, all of the details for homework and the labs and also the discussion forums will be on that page. So feel free to have a look at that. We definitely recommend that.
Cool. A question about host profiles from one vCenter apply to another vCenter. I believe they are common if you are running linked mode. I'd have to take that question on notice. It's not one I'm 100% positive of. What will happen if we're using the VCSA and upgrade the ESXi hosts? Nothing. So that's one of the beauties of the VMware environments. So what you do to the underlying hypervisor really will have a minimal impact on the virtual machine workloads themselves. One thing that may happen is that as you upgrade the hypervisor, you gain access to higher levels of virtual hardware. So virtual machine hardware version 7 to virtual machine hardware version 8 when you upgrade. So those benefits become available to you, but you're not forced to take them. So if you upgrade the ESXi host, you kind of have to do that offline, or with the. So if you do that upgrade, you'll take your vCenter environment down. That vCenter environment can be down at various times. That's not a massive issue as long as it's not down for a long period of time. Certainly you can reboot your vCenter server and your day-to-day general operations of your VMware environment won't fall over. Will ESXi 6.5 support Realtek NICs? I don't know. Very simple answer to that is go and check the hardware compatibility list that VMware publish. That will tell you straight out. I'm a big fan of Intel NICs in my hosts. In fact, I specify them by rule rather than exception. It includes, in fact, if a server has Broadcom or Realtek NICs on board, I generally will not purchase it, or I will at least go and purchase an add-on card with Intel NICs on them. The performance just seems so much better. And especially, I do a lot of iSCSI. I say that, and again, there's caveats. Sometimes the performance, 1% performance doesn't matter for some things. For iSCSI, it probably does, especially if you're trying to run high-performance SQL servers, as an example, which I've been known to do on occasion. It is possible sometimes to run up ESXi on non-supported hardware. There are some ways, and there's some information out there on doing that. So how to get a lab up on hardware where they don't support the NIC, that's sometimes possible. The question there will be is, what are you going to run ESXi up on if it's not bare metal, and does that support your Realtek NIC? Can you run the VCSA without DNS? Look, in theory you can. I would not recommend it. In fact, one of the things I strongly recommend for anyone running VMware is get your DNS working, because a lot of the functionality and certainly the enhanced functionality, things like HA, DRS, heart beating, relies, if not exclusively, but certainly works much better when your DNS is really working properly. In fact, I have not yet come across an environment in which go and fix your name resolution was not an appropriate answer. Under a home lab, yeah, okay, that's probably pushing it, in which case host files may be enough. Backing up the Postgres database on the VCSA, yeah, look, certainly Commvault does have a Postgres SQL agent. I don't know if installing that into the VCSA is supported. You would have to check with Commvault, they will tell you. The current environment that I'm primarily responsible for utilizes Commvault as a backup tool. There was a question earlier, the difference between ESX and ESXi. Well, the really short and simple answer is ESX is dead, ESXi is not. The longer answer is that ESX was an earlier product that was less efficient. It had effectively, in fact, the console and the management console and functionality within it effectively actually ran within a virtual machine that sat on top of the hypervisor. It was bigger, it was bloatier, it used more resources, it didn't perform as well, and they got rid of it, and there's not been too many tears. Explain a cluster in general in terms of VMware and vSphere. A cluster is a number of ESXi hosts managed by vCenter, which are used to provide pooled resources to your VMware workloads. So your workloads will be moved amongst that cluster in order to satisfy HA or DRS functionality requirements. So that they will tend to share storage, but they can't share CPU or RAM, so therefore any particular VM is allocated to a particular host, but can be moved to other hosts if required using vMotion.
Robert, I might jump in now and say we've still got 350 odd people in attendance, which is fantastic considering we're now over half an hour late.
Yep.
And there's still questions coming in, which is really exciting because it means we've got a lot of engaged students. But I think we'll have to call it quits fairly shortly.
Yeah, I think
this is a great time to plug the...
I think I've done all the good questions, so yeah, I was about to come to that. Yeah,
and we've still got questions flooding in, so this is a great opportunity to plug the forums once they start working. Yep. Because these are great conversations that we can all sort of learn collaboratively, especially with the 6.5 being released just recently. So yeah, just start as many threads as you're interested in, and it looks like that's going to be a really interesting sort of few weeks where people who are just looking to learn about VMware can sort of get a very quick grounding and sort of an accelerated development, and those that are already quite good can discuss the nuts and bolts. So it's looking quite exciting.
Yeah, and certainly
I just want to thank you for
I'll be monitoring the forums.
Spending so much more time.
No, more than happy.
Thank you for.
I'll be monitoring the forums. So please, people do feel free to ask. My knowledge in VMware and other areas of technology is broad and deep. I can talk at length about storage and underlying storage. I can talk about underlying networking. I can talk about VMware. I can talk about Windows. I can touch on Linux and some other platforms. So if you have questions, do feel free to ask. If I don't know, I will say so, but I will endeavour to find out, or at least help you to find out.
And the chances are that
a copy of the questions from tonight as well, just a text copy. I'll send it through to you, Robert, and maybe you can post some more information about some of the more asked questions.
Yeah, certainly.
In the forums.
More than happy to.
And those questions that you won't be able to answer, there's 600 people with varying degrees of skill that might be able to help out. So
absolutely, it's one of the great things about this kind of event, or is that it allows people to go and share information and knowledge and learn from each other and build community, and it's a great thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. As I said, thanks heaps to Robert for spending so much more time than was initially planned. I think it's really great to see so many questions, and thank you to all of the students out there still listening. It's going to be a really great course, I think. But until then, I think we might have to call it a night. Thanks very much for your attention. We'll see you next week, 8 o'clock Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time for those of you in Queensland and beyond. So yeah, just once more, thanks very much to Robert.
Thank you all for attending. I do appreciate your attention and the opportunity to share some knowledge with you.
Beauty. We'll see you all next week, guys.
Thanks all. Bye.